If you are a die-hard horror fan like me, or even a casual enjoyer of scary movies, then you probably know about Universal Pictures' classic monsters or their classical horror films. And if you don't know them by name, you've probably seen them. You know the ones, those old black and white horror films with little grainy spots and olden-day Hollywood actors. These films have been referenced and parodied into oblivion. Perhaps you've dressed as one of these characters or seen them in the yearly lineup of neighborhood Halloween costumes. The point is, they are everywhere. This is because in their early days, Universal Pictures was responsible for creating and developing a certain look and theme that we associate with horror icons like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, and many more. For this video, I'd like to explore the world of Universal's early horror movies, starting with the 1920s and then moving on through the decades until we reach the 1950s. I know that technically the 60s is the decade that Universal Pictures stopped with their classical monsters, but I'd argue the genre lost all steam in the 50s. And for this video, the 50s is where I'll be stopping because this decade marked a definitive end for Universal's early horror movies. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To reach the end, we must first start at the beginning. So buckle up as we explore the mysterious, melancholic, spooky, and gothic era of horror, also known as Universal's classic horror. Before I begin this video, I would like to thank the lovely Antonia Carla for helping with the research of this video. I had reached out to her for questions about Universal Pictures' early history because she's actually a descendant of the founder of Universal Pictures. She provided me with clarification and answers, and her videos about Universal also provided more clarity. Please check her out and show her some love. Her videos are amazing. I will also be linking all the references that I use for research in the description of this video. Please go check them out because there are some really interesting article, think pieces, and books that could teach you a lot about Universal Pictures history and just olden day Hollywood in general.
Mr. Carla feels it would be a little unkind to present this picture without just a word of friendly warning. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you. So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to, well, we've warned you.
Universal Pictures, or simply Universal, is an American film production and distribution company. Universal was founded in 1912, making it one of America's oldest film studios. It was founded by German-American film producer Carl Laemmle and his fellow collaborators. Universal Studios began in Chicago, but while the company was birthed there, Carl Laemmle purchased a ranch in California near the San Fernando Valley. This ranch would become the world's first film studio dedicated to the production and development of feature-length films, as well as the beating heart of all of Universal's projects. Universal's early days were largely spent establishing themselves in Hollywood, taking their initial steps in the film industry and attempting to make themselves known to the American audience. This was done by following trends and doing whatever was popular. Universal dabbled with westerns, comedies, and action-adventures, which were booming at the time. It is also important to note that Carl Laemmle was not a newcomer to the film industry. He had already opened his first theater in 1906 when he was 39 years old, so this gave him a level of experience. From 1915 to the 1920s, Universal ran its management and production in a particular way. They produced their own films and distributed them domestically and to some international markets. They focused on making shorts and low-budget feature films, films that were usually low-quality bait to test the waters and that wouldn't hurt them financially if the films were flops. Another noteworthy component of Universal's production and management was the incorporation of sound into their films. The emergence of sound films or talking pictures fundamentally changed Hollywood and filmmaking. Universal, like many a film studio, jumped onto the trend, seeing the potential of talkies. Their first sound film was made in 1928 and is actually a very interesting story. I would recommend Antonio Carlato's video on Universal's first sound film if you're interested in hearing more. 1928 was also the year Carl Laemmle ceded control of production at Universal to his 21-year-old son, Carl Jr. Laemmle. Jr. would reevaluate their production and distribution methods, deciding that some changes needed to be made. According to Morals, Markets, and Horror Pictures, The Rise of Universal Pictures and the Hollywood Production Code by Carl Edwards, Jr. Laemmle decided that Universal needed something to help them stand out. They needed an identity that would set them apart from the other film studios. Junior Lemley believed they needed high-quality films, and despite the finances of Universal being unsteady at times, he was determined to see this through. So, Junior Lemley suggested straying away from westerns and comedies and instead setting their sights on the genre of horror. Junior Lemley insisted that the company concentrate on the production of horror films for the time being, since a single production category would allow Universal to cut costs in some areas. And wouldn't you know it, Junior was proven right. Universal had struck gold with its horror category, and for the next 30 years, the film studio would not only latch onto this genre, but help sculpt and create staples among it. So, let's look at these years. Without further ado, let's make our way into the first decade, the 1920s. When people think of Universal's classic monsters or horror films, most often think of the films and horror icons that were created between the 1930s and 1940s. This was due to the abundance of horror media Universal was pumping out in these two particular decades, as well as the increased film budgets that allowed Universal Pictures to produce higher quality films and peddle them to larger audiences. Unfortunately, this means that the 1920s is not as remembered in comparison and is often neglected in discussions about the early horror films of Universal, despite being the decade that laid the foundation for the genre. The 1920s started themes and aesthetics that would be recycled in many of the later Universal horror films and are still being used today in modern horror. These films also assisted in establishing the careers of many actors, making them the face of horror for their distinctive decade or generation. But to understand what horror films were like at Universal in the 1920s, we must go back in time and look at the period. The 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties, were a burgeoning period for cinema and filmmaking. It was, and still is, considered one of the greatest economic periods in America, not only for businesses, but for the American people. During this period, Universal and other film studios were raking in cash because more and more Americans were gravitating towards film. They could do so because of their increased incomes. This led films to become very popular, and cinemas, or movie palaces as they were once called, started to pop up everywhere. At the time of the great film boom, Universal wasn't the rich powerhouse that it is now, and their funds weren't as steady. This was easily reflected in their films, which were mostly low budget. Aside from being grainy and wordless, Universal horror films had begun to follow the trend of incorporating hyper-expressiveness and visual distortions into their film aesthetics. This was due to the growing popularity of the German art style of Expressionism and Surrealism, which were creeping into film as the 1920s progressed. However, it is important to note that the styles were already popular in the art community long before they had even hit the big screens. These Surrealist and Expressionist films were often angsty and stylized. From what I researched and read, they were meant to represent a distorted reality, something akin to a dream or a nightmarish-like state, with their odd landscapes, lighting, shadows, and camera angles. Things as simple as backdrops, costumes, or even facial expressions were twisted and contorted to establish a certain narrative convention in addition to showing the emotional state of a character. Universal adopted this style to heighten the spooky elements of their horror films, and while other film studios did use Expressionism and Surrealism, Universal is often associated with a very specific type of aesthetic, more so the mythical and gothic type. While on the topic of Germany and European cinema in general, I want to mention something I found from the book The Horror Film from the Depth of Field series. Universal, in addition to adopting a European style of filmmaking, also employed various European talents. Carl Laemmle had hired E.A. DuPont at Universal Pictures for a lucrative contract. E.A. DuPont was a German film director and was considered to be a pioneer in the German film industry. Carl would go on to hire Dmitry Buchowski, a Russian film director and screenwriter, as well as Paul Fajos, who was a Hungarian-American director. This is just to name a few. I'm so sorry if I butchered any names. Pronunciation of names has never been my strong suit. There were so many European filmmakers, actors, and other talents working for Universal Pictures at the time that it was considered the most European film studio in America. This isn't surprising considering that Carl Laemmle himself was a European immigrant and probably knew the value of European filmmakers and wanted to help those from his community. As stated before, the horror films that Universal produced in the 1920s weren't many compared to the amount they would later release in the later decades. In fact, they only released 5 official films during this decade that could be considered horror: The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Phantom of the Opera, The Cat and the Canary, The Man Who Laughs, and The Last Warning. Of these 5 films, 2 were more popular than the others, or rather more memorable to horror. The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera were among the most popular horror films released by Universal Pictures in the 1920s, and both films starred prolific actor and makeup artist Lon Chaney, who some would consider Universal's very first It Boy. These 2 films were the first real strides Universal took in defining its own niche in horror and establishing itself with monsters. The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera's popularity was due to Lon Chaney's performance and makeup techniques. Keep in mind this was before Hollywood had proper makeup departments that specialized in prosthetics or any type of gore. The second reason for the popularity of these two films was the trope that we now know as the misunderstood villain or monster trope, which was employed for both of Lon Chaney's characters. This trope centers on the concept of being misunderstood. These villains or monsters are not evil or deliberately malicious. They are frequently misidentified as deviants by those around them because of their unusual appearances or odd mannerisms. Their villainy stems from being different. Additionally, though these characters may struggle with their impulses and temperaments or even dabble in the supernatural, they are still shown to have some sort of emotions and reasonable motivations, and thus can be considered sympathetic. In The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Lon Chaney plays the character of Quasimodo, the recluse bell ringer of the Grand Paris Cathedral. He is mistreated and judged by his master, and the townfolk who look down on him for his appearance. At the end of the film, he dies defending Esmeralda, a woman who, like Quasimodo, is a social outcast. The film tells a story of prejudice and discrimination, but most importantly, it teaches us not to judge based on appearances, which goes back to the trope of misunderstood monster. However, Quasimodo isn't a monster. In fact, he and the other so-called monsters from the 20s were just humans, most of the time humans with disabilities or humans who are disfigured, which says a lot about how they viewed people back then, but that is an entirely different story. After The Hunchback of Notre Dame was released, it became quite popular instantly and grossed $3 million. After witnessing such success, Universal was quick to capitalize and replicate the themes and aesthetics that had made The Hunchback of Notre Dame so popular. 2 years later, Lon Chaney's acting and makeup capabilities were utilized once more. They gave audiences what they wanted, another misunderstood monster movie in the form of The Phantom of the Opera. Lon Chaney worked hard to create a creature American audiences had never seen before. He adorned a skull cap, glued down his ears, applied false teeth, and applied makeup under his eyes and all over his face to create a pale, rotten, and grotesque sight. Now, to modern audiences like us who've been subjected to many terrors and scares throughout the years, this seems rather tame and unscary, but to people in the 1920s, this was practically Satan incarnate. And according to some accounts, first-time viewers of The Phantom's face screamed and fainted in the cinemas, though I do believe that some of these accounts are exaggerated. While The Phantom of the Opera was much like The Hunchback of Notre Dame in the sense that both films featured a misunderstood and recluse character, where the characters differed were their characterization and morals. The Phantom was the bad guy in his film. He is the villain, no doubt about it. In The Phantom of the Opera, we follow aspiring young opera singer Christine, who is trying to become famous, as well as the lead singer at the opera house. But in pursuing her dream, she begins to get stalked, but also helped by a mysterious admirer. This mysterious man called Eric, also known as the Phantom, lives under the opera house and is rumored to be a supernatural being. Eventually, the Phantom takes Christine as a prisoner, intending to be her lover through force. But Christine's fiancé, Raoul, comes to save her, and the Phantom is killed by a mob of people at the end of the film. Side note, justice for Raoul. Those who have seen the 2004 remake know what I mean. Like I said before, the Phantom is the villain of the story. He is not as cruel or as malicious as other villains may be, but he is still a villain. He's stalking a woman for God's sake. However, this did not stop audiences from empathizing with the Phantom's suffering and loneliness. The Phantom was particularly popular among women who found his yearning for Christine to be hot. The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame were hits for Universal and remain to this day the founders of Universal's horror. The later films may have remixed the elements of both films, but their influence cannot be denied. And that concludes what I have to say about the 1920s. It's time to look at the following decade, and probably my favorite, the 1930s. Moving to the 1930s, the landscape of Universal Pictures had changed drastically, as had the world of cinema and film. The cultural landscape of the United States had changed too. It was no longer a country of economic prosperity and had been thrust into the Great Depression. If you know anything about the Great Depression or the issues that plagued the economy in the 1930s, then you know it was responsible for ending the careers of many film studios, particularly the up-and-coming ones. Still, even big film studios were not safe either. While Universal Pictures was able to survive the film studio purge, it still faced struggles that halted its progress. What Universal experienced in the 1930s can be broken down into two parts. In the early 1930s, the studio was able to find success with their new horror films, but in the latter half of the 1930s, particularly past 1936, Universal faced financial trouble and failure at the box office. But back to the Great Depression for a moment. The global economic downturn affected many countries across the world, but the United States was hit particularly hard. This resulted in massive job losses. By 1933, 24.9% of the total workforce in America was unemployed. Families now had to split up in search of cheaper homes, cars, and utilities. Consumerism had dropped remarkably. The ability to freely watch films was now considered a luxury, which isn't surprising. How could anyone afford to see a film when they couldn't even afford to keep the lights on? And so, naturally, cinemas and film studios saw a stagnation in profits. 8,000 movie theaters were closed by 1932. But where was Universal in all of this? Well, they were doing alright. Actually, I wouldn't say alright, since they had lost $2.2 million due to film failures and the effects of the Great Depression. But as I said before, they were not without success. During this time, Universal was still focusing on the production of horror movies, which oddly enough brought comfort to the American audiences. The Universal horror movies of the 1930s were similar to those of the 1920s. They employed the standard conventions, the lightings, the spookiness. Expressionism was still the favored aesthetic of horror films. But what differed in these new horror films was that the monsters were now actually monsters. They were monsters with supernatural abilities, monsters that lurk in the shadows, inhumane and grotesque. Universal also ramped up the drama and terror of their newer horror films, and sometimes would tap into comedy. However, we'll talk about that later. Something I should also mention is the cultural relevance of the horror films from the 1930s. I cannot stress enough how impactful these films were and still are. As I said before, Universal's horror films are still being referenced, parodied, and rebooted to this day. And it's this popularity that makes everyone remember the 1930s. That, and also there were like a ton of horror films from this decade, good and bad. There was Dracula, Dracula the Spanish version, Frankenstein, The Mummy, Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, The Black Cat, The Raven, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, The Werewolf of London, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula's Daughter, The Invisible Ray, Night Key, The Phantom Creeps, Son of Frankenstein, and Tower of London. I cannot discuss every single one of these films in depth without making my video even longer than it needs to be, so I'll discuss the most culturally significant and iconic of these films. I think we should start with the most renowned, Dracula 1931. It is unsurprising and unavoidable that Dracula would have been discussed in this video, just as Dracula's influence on vampires, horror, and pop culture in general is unavoidable. Dracula 1933 is the origin and starting point for so much of what we associate with vampires today. The capes, spooky castles, sleeping in coffins, turning into bats, and the overall sexiness. Universal was one of the first few film studios to establish and introduce what a vampire was to worldwide audiences, because they were quick to adapt Bram Stoker's novel and transfer his creation to the big screen. And before anyone says anything, yes, I am aware that Nosferatu came out before Dracula, and so did Dracula Halala, but Nosferatu cannot be considered an adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, and Dracula Halala is technically a lost film. Additionally, there is also the 1924 adaptation which Dracula 1931 draws influence from, but we'll leave that out for now since it's not a movie. The idea of adapting Bram Stoker's Dracula first began to float around when Carl Laemmle Jr. took an interest in the novel and began pushing the idea to his father. Universal showed favour towards this vision, so they cast Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi as Dracula and allowed Todd Browning to direct the film with the help of Karl Freund as his first sound feature film, and from there the rest is history. We all know the story of Dracula, whether it be Nicolas Cage's Dracula, Adam Sandler's Dracula, or even William Marshall's Dracula. But for those who may have been living under a rock or trapped in a tomb for the last century, Dracula is about a vampire named Count Dracula, unsurprisingly. In the original 1931 moving picture, we follow Count Dracula who travels from Transylvania to London. In London, he follows a young woman named Mina, the daughter of Dr. Van Helsing, who is a secret vampire hunter. Dracula wants to transform Mina into another one of his vampire brides, while Van Helsing aims to put an end to the Count's spree of terror in England, as well as stop him from claiming his daughter's soul. There is a lot to be said about Dracula. I will not try to analyze it in depth or explain every little detail of the film because there are videos out there that do a much better job than I could. But if I could try and explain Dracula's success, I'd boil it down to three things. Bela Lugosi's hypnotic, mysterious, and subtly sensual performance as the dashing Count, the introduction of vampires to an audience that were not well versed with their mythos, and Universal's growing popularity and ability to exploit their horror niche. But first, Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi's performance as Dracula is iconic. That is indisputable. His charismatic and mysterious persona combined with his Hungarian accent and striking facial features not only added to the supernatural and otherworldly feel of the film, but helped Count Dracula stand out from the other film monsters. Dracula was sophisticated, romantic, and charming, but still foreboding. This drew audiences in and they fell in love with the Count, especially women who enjoyed Dracula's sex appeal. And you can debate this in the comments section, but I personally think that Dracula was one of the first, if not the first film that made it okay for people to be attracted to monsters and supernatural creatures. This of course would continue in the following years with other Universal monsters and it would get wild by the 1940s, but make no mistake, Dracula is Universal's first monster sexy man. Dracula was a great success for Universal Pictures upon release and it helped them out of their debt. It also brought more eyes to Universal in terms of their horror films. But if I talk about Dracula, I must of course talk about Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a film that is just as memorable and iconic as Dracula, if not better depending on who you ask. It is another of Universal's horror films that became a staple in pop culture and horror. Like Dracula, it is not necessarily the first film adaptation of its source material, but it is certainly referenced a lot and has greatly impacted horror. As most of you already know, Frankenstein tells the story of the scientist Victor Frankenstein who manages to reanimate a corpse. And yes, Frankenstein is the name of the scientist, not his creation. But because saying Frankenstein is easier than saying Frankenstein's creation, and since most of us already refer to Victor's monster as Frankenstein, that is what I shall refer to him as. Frankenstein came out in 1933 during the same year as Dracula but months after in November, and went to garner even more success and profits. Frankenstein was the highest grossing film of 1931. There had been a big push to adapt and make Frankenstein after the popularity of Dracula. Universal believed that making a horror film with yet another monster would bring in double the numbers, and they were right. America hungered for a new monster, a new horror film, and a new scare. To make Frankenstein, Universal had employed James Whale as the film's director, Jack Pierce as head of makeup, and Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster, though originally the studio had wanted Bela Lugosi to be Frankenstein. But apparently, James Whale saw the potential in Boris Karloff, who he believed was better suited for the role. Boris Karloff, up until this point, had mostly been under the radar of American audiences despite being in more than 70 films. Like Bela Lugosi, his film role with Universal helped him become recognizable, and like Lugosi, Chaney, and many more to come, he would join the lineup of Universal's It Boys. Frankenstein was a new and fresh-faced monster, completely different from the suave Dracula. He was a unique creation aesthetically and thematically. He was a creature that was meant to look thrown together, yet the themes of the movie were everything but thrown together. The film had layers of emotional complexity. It also goes back to Universal's favorite trope of a misunderstood monster. The monster of this film is not the traditional monster, and in this case is a victim. Frankenstein is a creature brought to life by the manic pursuit of a scientist who seeks to push the laws of nature with little regard for the consequences that may come and those who may suffer. In the short time Frankenstein is alive, he is faced with nothing but sadness and alienation, and the only connection he can form with another person ends horribly, and the film ends on an even somber note. Audiences in the 1930s ate this up, and rightfully so. After Frankenstein, Universal continued to dominate the box office with more monster movies. They had a pretty good run, but sadly things wouldn't remain this way for long, because all good things must come to an end. Earlier I mentioned that the 1930s was divided into two parts for Universal. Well, we've now reached the point where we have to talk about the late 1930s. The studio began to feel the effects of the Depression. They were experiencing financial difficulties and failure to garner profits due to box office flops, but the biggest calamity to Universal was yet to come. In 1936, after constant financial setbacks, loans, and film failures, particularly the failure of Showboat, Carl and Junior Laemmle sold Universal and would both retire soon after, though at separate times. If you would like to know more about this, I again recommend Antonia Carlata's channel. She has a video about the film Showboat and what went on behind the scenes. I just want to say something before I move on to the next section. In researching everything for this video, I came across countless articles, videos, and books that described Carl and Junior as innovators and creatives. I agree with such statements. Carl and Junior were a great duo. Carl really knew how to market and talk up the projects at Universal, while Junior had a knack for knowing what audiences wanted to see and getting the right people involved to make it happen. I can't help but feel that Universal was something very precious to them outside of money, and that a little part of the studio died with them when they left. That is in terms of horror films. Obviously Universal Pictures was able to find success after their departure, and still has to this day. But things just weren't the same after they left. This brings us to the next era of Universal, the 1940s. the era of oversaturation and where I personally believe that the monster films began to lose steam. If you thought the 1930s had a lot of changes, then hold on to your hats because the 1940s was a completely different time. For one, America was finally out of the Great Depression, but they could not catch a break because they were then thrust into World War II. During and after World War II, the American film industry experienced various changes. One of these changes, more so challenges, was another decline in cinema attendance. This was not the first time cinemas in America had experienced a decline in numbers. A similar decline was witnessed in the 1930s, which was fueled by the poverty of the Great Depression, whereas the decline in the 1940s was exacerbated by the effects of World War II, poverty, and the readjustment that society had to experience. On top of all this madness, American film studios faced the threat of television. TV sets or television were being bought more and more by American families. Electronic TV had existed before the 1940s but was not yet accessible to the average household. But now they were popping up more and more. To be clear, television had not exactly taken over the role of cinema, but it did provide an alternative. Television sets were a newer, snazzier technological advancement, appreciated mostly due to their accessibility and novelty. The shift from movie theaters towards television sets would be particularly felt past 1946 and moving into the 50s. And again, to reiterate, televisions had not replaced cinema by any means during this time. I only point out its popularity as a slight factor that film historians recognize as a contributor to the lowering attendance rates for films during the 1940s, and by proxy a contributor to the universal decline in horror. It's a small factor, but a factor nonetheless. Aside from the acute threat of television and TV shows, oversaturation is determined to be one of the biggest killers of Universal's horror during the 1940s, and I wholeheartedly agree with this. The 1940s was a decade of immense oversaturation for Universal Pictures, defined mostly by remakes, comedies, and crossovers. Repeat that formula and you get 37 Universal horror films in total, some better than the others. Let's see if I can read them all without taking a breath. Black Friday, The Invisible Man Returns, The Invisible Woman, The Mummy's Hand, The Man-Made Monster, The Wolf Man, The Mad Doctor of Market Street, The Black Cat, Horror Island, The Ghost of Frankenstein, Night Monster, Invisible Agent, The Mummy's Tomb, Frankenstein Meets the Wolf Man, Phantom of the Opera, Son of Dracula, Captive Wild Woman, The Mad Ghoul, Calling Dr. Death, Weird Woman, Dead Man's Eyes, The Climax, House of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man's Revenge, Jungle Woman, The Mummy's Ghost, The Mummy's Curse, The Jungle Captive, House of Dracula, The Frozen Ghost, Strange Confession, Pillow of Death, House of Horrors, The Brute Man, She-Wolf of London, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and finally Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer. To say that the studio released many horror films during this decade is an understatement. The 1940s account for most of Universal Pictures' classic horror catalogue. However, the 1940s are not always looked upon as fondly or appreciated by some. These films are sometimes looked down upon because audiences in the 1940s and modern audiences deemed them unoriginal, only existing to capitalize off the success of films people had already seen. This is not to say that the horror films produced by Universal during this decade weren't good or were unsuccessful. Quite the opposite, actually. Despite growing complaints, these newer, wackier, and comedic horror movies kept the attention of audiences and incentivized Universal to keep making them. Because regardless of complaints, people were still going to see their favorite monsters and villains. Okay, so slight side note. Remember how I told you that Carl Laemmle and Jr. left Universal? Well, they weren't the only ones to leave. I'm sad to report that Jack Pierce was suddenly fired from Universal in 1946 after 20 years of creating so many different iconic monsters. For those who don't know, Jack Pierce was the head of Universal's makeup department. I mentioned him earlier in this segment about Frankenstein, but I didn't go into much detail. Jack Pierce was a legend in his field, much like Lon Chaney. He had a way of bringing creatures to life. You could always count on him to surprise and scare audiences with a new monster. Without him, we wouldn't have Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman, and the list goes on. He was a big part of Universal Pictures. I don't think the studio would be as successful without his contributions. But I suppose that meant nothing to those who fired him, because it is rumored that Jack's firing was due to Universal's lack of patience towards his techniques, which were less modern and often took time. I bring up Jack Pierce because he was a victim of this out with the old and in with the new mentality that was permeating throughout Universal during the 1940s. But I digress. As you've probably guessed, it's time to discuss two horror films from the 1940s. In every segment, I discuss the trends and themes as well as two films that encapsulate the specific decade. For this decade, the two films I've chosen are The Wolfman and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. During the 1940s, Universal incorporated comedy and crossover into their horror films. They were also rebooting a lot of their movies. One of these reboots was The Wolfman 1941. The Wolfman is a retelling of The Werewolf of London. This film follows a young man named Larry who becomes afflicted with lycanthropy and goes on a rampage as a werewolf that he can't control. And unfortunately for Larry, he meets a sad end. I think The Wolfman is one of the better reboots of the 1940s. It is such a good movie. It has some amazing makeup and costume design, and the performance from Lon Chaney Jr. was great. Lon Chaney proved that the ability to act clearly ran in the family. However, the appeal of The Wolfman nowadays has been heavily debated, with some even arguing that The Werewolf of London is a better film artistically. And while this may be true, in the end, The Wolfman was and still is the more popular film. Side note, The Wolfman has some interesting thematics in comparison to the other horror films like it. The Wolfman, like the other Universal monsters, is sympathetic, but this is not really what stands out about the film. What stands out is the unsettling idea that a man, no matter how pure good or God-fearing, could become a terrifying creature ravaged by anger and bloodlust. There is a line from the film that has become an iconic quote. The quote states,
"Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright."
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. Each time I hear this phrase, I can't help but wonder if the film's concept was influenced by the current war at the time that exposed the depravity of humanity and man's innate darkness. All this was observed by Kurt Sidomak, the Wolfman screenwriter. An important thing to note about Kurt was that he was a Jewish man who escaped Nazi Germany while he could. I'm not the first person to point this out or make such a connection. There is actually a very good think piece about this topic written by Christina Werner called The Wolfman, Evil in Every Man. I'm going to link it down below if anyone wants to read more about it. There are many ways to interpret The Wolfman, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to say World War II had a strong influence on the creation of the film. Moving on, the second film I want to talk about is Bud Abbott and Lou Costello Meet Frankenstein, more commonly known as Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. It is a comedy horror film that follows comedians Abbott and Costello as they encounter Universal's classic monsters and villains. This film did numbers for Universal, and I mean numbers. The film grossed $3.2 million. It was Universal's second highest grossing film that year, and the film is now recognized as a historically significant film, which led it to be selected for the preservation in the National Film Registry by the freaking Library of Congress. And how could the film not be successful? Abbott and Costello were household names who had been popular for years, so putting them next to faces like Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney was a money-making guarantee. This crossover is comparable to Avengers Endgame in some ways. I'm not really going to talk about the plot of the film or its themes, I more so want to talk about what happened when the cameras weren't rolling. You see, behind the scenes, the production of the film and the push to make it wasn't exactly the easiest, and you'd be surprised to know that a few executives at Universal didn't see the value in Abbott and Costello and underestimated this film heavily. Universal was caught in a financial tiff again, which wasn't anything new for them. Universal had faced financial strain before and could usually bounce back with a film that pleased audiences and helped keep the studio afloat. But making such a film and counting on it to be the next blockbuster was not so easy. Their solution to their rut came in the form of Abbott and Costello. But they had been dragging their feet since 1943 until it was finally official in 1948. But even after having the project greenlit, the production proved to be difficult. Abbott and Costello were rumored to have fought a lot. Lou Costello also supposedly didn't like the first draft of the film, which led to it being changed. Lou Costello also would have left the film if not for the paycheck. And then there are the rumored food fights. If you want to know about this, again, Antonia Carla is the girl for you. Seriously, hit up her channel, it's freaking amazing. That is all I have to say about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein as well as the 1940s. Now, I think it's best to move on to the final stage of Universal's horror film, a stage that I refer to as the graveyard, better known as the 1950s. By the 1950s, most of Universal's horror characters were being discontinued. There were no more Dracula or Frankenstein. Universal's traditional revival strategies such as remakes or crossovers were failing to elicit the same level of interest or excitement. They were losing popularity, which is quite normal for Hollywood cycles. This happens all the time. Any genre that dominates the big screen always begins to lose relevancy, and Universal was no different. By this point, television had momentarily stolen the attention of American consumers. Earlier I mentioned the gradual transition from films to television as the primary entertainment medium in the 1940s. I explained how it wasn't as popular during that decade, but of course this changed. Television really took off in the 50s. This meant that Universal had to adjust how they distributed horror pictures as well as the kind of horror films they produced. They began adopting a variety of strategies to keep their viewer base. They employed the strategy of re-releasing their most popular films in theaters and then airing them on television. Universal Pictures also began to merchandise their monsters and villains in the form of toys, and then they began using 3D. Universal hopped onto the snazzy and exciting wave of 3D films during the golden age of 3D in Hollywood. Aside from the use of 3D, there was a shift in the type of monsters that Universal Pictures was featuring in their new horror movies. The monsters were now space invaders from different planets. Universal Pictures were dipping their toes into the world of sci-fi. This shift was adjacent to America's growing taste for the genre and what historians recognized as fears related to nuclear power, spurred by the Cold War. Only 20 horror films were released by Universal during the 1950s. That's more than the 1920s, but less than the 1930s and 40s. There was Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, The Strange Door, The Black Castle, Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, It Came from Outer Space, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Revenge of the Creature, Cult of the Cobra, The Island Earth, Tarantula, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, The Creature Walks Among Us, The Mole People, The Incredible Shrinking Man, The Deadly Mantis, The Land Unknown, The Monolith Monsters, The Thing That Couldn't Die, Monsters on the Campus, Curse of the Undead, and The Leech Woman. For the final two films of this timeline, I'd like to discuss It Came from Outer Space and Creature from the Black Lagoon. It Came from Outer Space was released in 1953. If the name doesn't give it away, it is indeed a sci-fi film and one of Universal's first 3D productions. The film was directed by Jack Arnold, who joined Universal Studios in 1953. He was considered to be one of the best sci-fi film flick directors of the 50s. Prior to making movies, Jack Arnold dabbled in the world of documentaries. He would then go on to direct this film.
Go ahead and kill me, nigger. Mr. Nigger to you. He's so bad, they call him boss. He's a boss nigger.
Truly a man of many shades. It Came from Outer Space follows the story of a very odd alien invasion. A new species comes to Earth and is discovered by two humans when a UFO crashes into the desert, and soon after, chaos ensues. However, the aliens aren't hostile, more so curious about Earth. The strange creatures or monsters in these films are the aliens, and they, like many of Universal's creations, are misunderstood by humans because of their appearance. But I can't say they are completely innocent since they do kidnap humans. But then again, most of the Universal monsters are never completely innocent, which is why we love them. It Came from Outer Space was one of the most successful sci-fi films of the 1950s, of course due to its 3D technology, special effects, makeup, and costume design. However, this does not imply that the film is perfect or was positively received. There were split opinions of this film. For some, It Came from Outer Space is considered one of the weaker films that came out of the sci-fi golden age of the 50s. This opinion is even held now amongst modern audiences who believe this film is boring and predictable. This is an understandable criticism, but it's also important to remember that even some of Universal's most successful and popular early horror films face the same criticism of being bland when upheld to modern standards. But regardless of whatever opinions are held about It Came from Outer Space, the film was successful and remains iconic to this day. When it was released in May 1953, it grossed $6.5 million. Moving on swiftly to Creature from the Black Lagoon. Creature from the Black Lagoon came out a year after It Came from Outer Space, and it is what I consider the last great Universal monster and last great Universal horror film from the classic collection. It is a blend of all the things Universal's horror was in its earlier and later days. The film was directed by Jack Arnold, who was deemed more than capable by the studio to handle the project following the success of It Came from Outer Space. I could talk about this film all day, but let's start with the cast, more importantly, the gill man, or the fish monster of this film. He was played by two people, Ben Chapman for the scenes on land and Rico Browning for any scenes that required swimming, because he was 6'5" and his stature made the creature more menacing. The costume design and overall makeup of the gill man was primarily thanks to Millicent Patrick and Bud Westmore. The two, while working in tandem with other sculptors, created the creature. However, despite working together to create such an eye-catching creature and both receiving praise equally, Millicent Patrick was actually fired shortly after the film's release, and all her credits were diminished. And you may wonder why. Well, this was because Bud Westmore became jealous of her success. Do I have to remind you that this is the same guy that replaced Jack Pierce? Just thinking about it gets me heated. But that's not what we're here to talk about right now. The premise of The Creature from the Black Lagoon is that a group of scientists are trying to find the missing link. So, to find it, they travel to the Amazon forest, but they encounter the creature otherwise known as the Gill Man, who inhabits a mysterious black lagoon. The Gill Man quickly becomes infatuated with Kay and seeks to make her his own. The Creature from the Black Lagoon employs a lot of Universal's old tropes. Like Dracula, it has a monster who is in love with a woman and stalks her, and like Frankenstein, the creature is an oddity to those around it because of its imposing and odd frame. But there's a lot more to The Creature from the Black Lagoon than that. The film explores themes of monster eroticism, scientific exploration and discovery, and environmental messages. The film also has some beautiful and captivating shots, especially the underwater scenes. The Creature from the Black Lagoon also has a legacy of inspiring other films. The most notable are The Shape of Water and Hellboy. But did you know that The Creature from the Black Lagoon also inspired the film Jaws? Try watching these films side by side and I guarantee you'll notice some similarities in the camera shots and angles. Creature from the Black Lagoon is such a fascinating film. The imagery has always stuck with me for some reason. Perhaps this is because I've always been enamored with mermaids and underwater sea creatures, but I think there is something so earnest about this film. Yes, there are times where it comes off as goofy with the chase scenes, but it doesn't take away from the charm of the movie. The Creature from the Black Lagoon premiered officially on February 12, 1954. The film grossed $1.3 million at the US box office, which isn't the best for Universal, but still. 2 sequels would be made afterwards, but we don't talk about those two. As I said before, Creature from the Black Lagoon is what I believe to be the last great Universal horror film, and I think it's the perfect send-off for this video. And there you have it, that is a brief history and timeline of the classical Universal horror films. Before you say anything, I know this video is quite long, but the information that I've provided is quite brief and basic in terms of all of Universal's history. After the 50s, Universal's classic horror style began to die out. It changed to adjust to the changing culture and taste of the 60s. The 1960s gave way to a new wave of horror that was filled with explicit gore, sex, and themes that challenged the views of traditional America. But that's a story for another day. If you'd like to watch another video about Universal, more particularly the first zombie film ever made, I suggest you check out my video on White Zombie. If not, feel free to check out my other timeline videos which will be linked in the playlist.